The story of Stoicism is not about quiet acceptance. It is a story of radical defiance. We often hear about this ancient philosophy as a tool for calm, a way to detach from a chaotic world. But that is a profound misunderstanding. At its core, Stoicism contained an uncompromising code of justice, a set of principles so demanding they forced philosophers and statesmen to stare down the most powerful men on earth. This was not a theory discussed in safe classrooms. It was a lived reality that led directly to confrontation, exile, and a deliberate choice to face the end. In this exploration, you will discover the precise philosophical engine that made such breathtaking courage not just possible, but necessary. You will see how figures like Thrasea Paetus and Helvidius Priscus applied this code against emperors like Nero and Domitian, while Marcus Aurelius wrestled with its paradox from the throne itself. How could a philosophy of inner peace demand such public warfare? What exactly was this unbreakable set of rules that turned reasoned thought into the ultimate act of rebellion? The answer reshapes everything we think we know about ancient wisdom. What does true courage look like when your principles are the only thing left to lose? This code began with a single, deceptively simple command: live in accordance with nature. At first glance, that phrase might conjure images of retreating to a quiet forest, a rejection of human complexity. But for the Stoic, this was the opposite of escape. It was an instruction for total engagement with reality. Nature, with a capital N, did not mean the untamed wilderness. It referred to the rational, intelligent fabric of the cosmos itself, a vast and ordered system governed by divine reason, what they called logos. Think of it not as a place, but as a principle, the ultimate operating system of everything that exists. And here is the crucial twist, the one that changes everything. Human beings, because we possess the faculty of reason, carry a fragment of that cosmic intelligence within our own minds. Our rational soul is literally a piece of the divine logos. Therefore, to live in accordance with nature means to live in perfect alignment with your own highest reason. It means making choices that are coherent, consistent, and virtuous, because virtue is the expression of that cosmic reason in a human life. To act against reason is to act against the fundamental order of the universe. It is a personal rebellion against the cosmos. Now, where does justice fit into this? In our modern view, we often treat justice as a societal invention, a set of rules we agree upon to keep the peace. For the Stoic, this was a profound error. Justice was not an add-on or a social contract. It was woven directly into that cosmic fabric. Because if the universe is a rational community, a single city of gods and men they called the Cosmopolis, then every rational being is a citizen of that city. And citizenship comes with duties. To harm another citizen, to lie, to steal, to oppress, is not merely a breach of man-made law. It is an act of irrationality. It is a violation of the natural bonds that hold the Cosmopolis together. An unjust person is, by definition, living contrary to nature. They are out of sync with the universe. This is the philosophical bedrock. When a Stoic philosopher looked at a tyrant, they did not see merely a powerful man doing evil. They saw a soul in revolt against the rational order, a citizen of the Cosmopolis betraying his fundamental duty. And their own fidelity to that higher, universal law created an obligation, a duty to bear witness against that betrayal. The defiance was not personal anger. It was cosmic housekeeping. This understanding of a cosmic community leads directly to the Stoics' most radical claim about human life. They declared that virtue is the only true good. Not wealth, not power, not even physical safety. Only the excellence of a rational soul living in harmony with nature qualifies as good. and this virtue, they taught, has 4 cardinal faces, 4 expressions of the same flawless character: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. But here is the part that changes everything for our story of defiance. The Stoics insisted these 4 virtues are utterly inseparable. You cannot pick and choose. You cannot have one without the others. They are like the 4 sides of a single, unbreakable block. If one side is cracked or missing, the entire structure collapses. This means you cannot call yourself wise if you use your knowledge to exploit others. That would be a failure of justice. You cannot call yourself courageous if your bravery serves a cruel cause. Again, a failure of justice. Every virtue is infused with every other, and at the heart of this indivisible block, giving it its social shape and purpose, is justice. For the Stoic, justice was not a vague feeling of fairness. It was a precise and active disposition, the unwavering habit of giving each person what is properly due to them within the Cosmopolis, the universal city. This due was not based on their social rank or their wealth, but on their shared citizenship in the rational order. It meant respecting their inherent worth, honoring agreements, and contributing to the common good. This transforms justice from a passive ideal into a daily, demanding practice. It is a social virtue. It happens between people. This created a stark divide in the ancient philosophical landscape. Other schools offered different paths. The Epicureans, for instance, advised seeking a tranquil life, often through withdrawal from public affairs to avoid the pain and trouble they could bring. The Cynics famously rejected social conventions altogether, seeking freedom in a life unburdened by ordinary duties. But the Stoic could not take these exits. Because if justice is an inseparable part of the only true good, then to withdraw from society, to shrug at injustice, is to become less virtuous, less good, less in harmony with nature itself. A Stoic philosopher cultivating wisdom in his study, while a tyrant ravaged the city outside his door, was a contradiction. His wisdom would be hollow, his courage untested, his temperance selfish. The virtues themselves, bound together, compelled a response. They forced a choice between comfort and coherence, between safety and integrity. This is the philosophical engine that made defiance inevitable. When an emperor demanded an act of betrayal or commanded silence in the face of cruelty, he was not just asking for political obedience. He was demanding that a Stoic fracture the very core of their being, to split justice from courage, to abandon the indivisible good. And for a true follower of this path, that was simply not an option. The code left no room for compromise. This unbreakable code required a model, a perfect example of its execution. The Stoics called this figure the sage. Imagine a human being who has fully integrated their fragment of cosmic reason, whose every thought and action flows in flawless harmony with nature. This sage would possess perfect wisdom, unshakable courage, complete self-control, and absolute justice, all functioning as one seamless whole. In the face of a tyrant's command, the sage would know precisely what to do, feel no paralyzing fear, and act with total moral clarity. It was the embodiment of their entire philosophy in a single person. Yet the ancient writers were remarkably honest about this ideal. They admitted the sage might be as rare as the Egyptian phoenix, a mythical creature that appears only once every 500 years. Some even wondered if such a person had ever truly existed. So why create an impossible standard? The genius of the concept lies not in its attainability, but in its direction. The sage was not a badge to be earned, but a compass. For the vast majority of people, the Stoics included themselves in this group, who are not sages but proficients, Latin for those who are making progress. The sage served as the definitive north on their moral map. When you are lost in a moral wilderness, facing a corrupt demand or a terrifying threat, you do not need a perfect map of every tree. You need to know which way is north. The question for a progressor was not, "What would I do?" but "What would the sage do?" That hypothetical action defined the direction of virtuous effort. It provided the bearing. This is how the historical Stoics navigated. Seneca advising Nero before their tragic rupture, or Thrasea Paetus refusing to attend the Senate under Nero's rule, were not declaring themselves perfect beings. They would have been the first to laugh at such a notion. They were progressors, using the ideal of the sage to orient themselves in a reality full of compromise. When Thrasea walked out of the Senate, he was not performing a gesture of perfected virtue. He was taking a deliberate step toward justice, away from complicity, aligning his actions as closely as he could with that northern star. His defiance was an expression of progress, not perfection. This crucial distinction transforms their stories from legends of superhuman beings into something far more powerful and relatable. It shows us a philosophy built for the struggle, designed for flawed individuals living in an unjust world. The goal was not to become the mythical sage overnight, but to never stop walking in that direction, especially when the path led directly toward the throne. What happens when that walk becomes a collision? This brings us to the heart of the apparent contradiction. How can a philosophy so focused on inner tranquility demand such public confrontation? The answer lies in a fundamental distinction, often misunderstood, between the internal citadel and the external battle. The Stoics taught that our ultimate fortress is not a physical place, but the realm of our own judgment. They called this the dichotomy of control. Some things are up to us and some things are not. What is up to us? Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, and our aversions. In short, the activity of our own ruling faculty, our ability to choose how we respond to any given situation. What is not up to us? Our body, our possessions, our reputation, and the actions of other people. We cannot control whether an emperor listens to reason or whether he orders our arrest. We cannot control the final outcome of our stand. This teaching is frequently mistaken for a recipe for political quietism, a justification to retreat inward and ignore the outer world. But that is a critical misreading. The dichotomy of control is not a map for retreat. It is a manual for correct engagement. What is decisively up to us includes our chosen actions in the public sphere. Our decision to speak truth, to refuse complicity, to vote our conscience, to defend the vulnerable. These are all exercises of our will, fully within our control. The Stoic maintains inner tranquility not by avoiding external conflict, but by choosing the right action for its own sake, and then releasing any desperate attachment to the result. The goal is virtuous action, not guaranteed victory. Think of it this way. A Stoic senator rising to condemn a corrupt law is in complete control of his speech, his reasoning, and his moral stance. That is his domain. He is not in control of whether his colleagues applaud or jeer, whether the law is repealed, or whether the emperor later sends guards to his house. Those outcomes belong to the realm of what is not up to us. His serenity comes from knowing he has fulfilled his duty as a rational citizen of the Cosmopolis. The potential punishment is an external, a thing to be endured with the same discipline. This reframes their defiance entirely. It was not a reckless gamble for political success. It was the ultimate exercise of internal sovereignty. Defying a tyrant was within their control. Surviving the tyrant's wrath was not. Their courage was the active expression of a soul that had secured its own citadel first. They entered the external battle not to control it, but to honor the one thing they truly could command, their own integrity. This turns the popular image of the Stoic completely on its head. They were not detached from the world. They were profoundly engaged with it, but on their own unshakable terms. So what did this look like when the palace guards finally arrived at the door? The first real test of this code came not from a distant rebel, but from a man living at the very center of power. Seneca the Younger, the famed Stoic philosopher, found himself in a position of unimaginable influence and peril. He was appointed as the tutor and later the chief advisor to a young emperor named Nero. This was the Stoic dream scenario, the chance to mold a ruler to create what Plato had called a philosopher king. Imagine the hope, the potential for good. Here was a brilliant thinker with direct access to the most powerful office in the world, tasked with instilling wisdom and justice into the heart of an empire. Seneca poured his philosophy into this project. He wrote a treatise for Nero titled On Mercy, a powerful document that framed mercy not as a weakness, but as the supreme virtue of a sovereign, the very thing that distinguished a true leader from a tyrant. He argued that an emperor secure in his own virtue had no need for cruelty. For a time, it seemed to work. The early years of Nero's reign, guided by Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, were surprisingly stable and moderate, a period later historians would call the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years. Seneca was navigating the lion's den, using political skill and philosophical persuasion to steer power toward justice, but the tension was built into the arrangement. Seneca's authority depended entirely on the whims of the man he was trying to guide. His Stoic code demanded he counsel justice, but his position required him to serve a power that was, by its nature, capricious. The fracture began slowly. Nero's true nature, his lust for absolute authority and public spectacle, began to surface. The advisor's voice of restraint became an irritant. The philosophical compass was pointing in a direction the emperor no longer wished to travel. The breaking point is widely known. After Nero was implicated in the death of his own mother, and as his reign descended into paranoia and brutality, Seneca recognized the impossible conflict. His continued presence in the court was no longer guidance, it was endorsement. To stay was to become complicit in the very injustice he was meant to oppose. He requested permission to retire, to withdraw his wealth, and step away from public life. It was a tactical retreat, an attempt to remove his stamp of approval from a regime he could no longer influence. But in the eyes of a tyrant, a withdrawal of support is itself an act of defiance. Years later, when Nero's paranoia reached a peak, he used a fabricated plot as pretext to order Seneca to take his own life. The account of his death, recorded by the historian Tacitus, is not merely a report of a passing. It is the script of a final, deliberate lesson. Upon receiving the order, Seneca showed no panic. He calmly called for his will, and when the centurion refused, he turned to his friends and said his only bequest was the example of his life. He embraced his wife and then, with a steady hand, opened his veins. As his life slowly ebbed away, he dictated his final thoughts to scribes. Even in his last moments, he was performing the philosopher's duty, turning his own end into a discourse on liberty. He was demonstrating absolute control over the one thing he truly commanded, his own exit. His death was not a surrender. It was the ultimate, logical conclusion of his position. When the code of justice could no longer be practiced in the halls of power, the final virtuous act was to refuse to let that power define him, even in his final breath. Seneca's story is often framed as a tragedy, a philosopher corrupted by wealth and compromised by politics, but through the lens of the Stoic code, it reads differently. It is the story of a progressor who walked the razor's edge between influence and integrity for as long as possible, and when the edge disappeared, chose to fall on the side of principle. His failure was not philosophical, it was political, and in that failure he enacted the philosophy's most severe demand. But what happens when the defiance is not a final, private act, but a sustained, public performance designed to shame an empire? While Seneca's final act was a private lesson in liberty, another senator chose a different form of warfare. Thrasea Paetus turned the Senate floor itself into a theater of silent defiance. He was not an advisor whispering in the emperor's ear, but a peer, a fellow senator who understood the power of the institution's own rituals. His weapon was not a sword or a speech, but a deliberate and calculated absence. When Nero's regime demanded unanimous applause for its increasingly erratic and cruel decisions, Thrasea developed a tactic of profound simplicity. He would attend the sessions, fulfilling his duty of presence, but he would refuse to cast his vote. He would withhold his voice. In a system built on consensus and ceremony, his silence was deafening. It was a refusal to lend his auctoritas, his moral authority, to actions he deemed unjust. The most famous moment came during the trial of a senator named Epictetus, whom Nero had targeted. The Senate, cowed by fear, was debating a harsh sentence. Thrasea did not shout or protest. When his turn came to speak, he rose, offered a mild alternative, and when it was ignored, he simply turned and walked out of the chamber. That solitary exit was more powerful than any fiery oration. It was a physical severing of his connection to the proceeding, a statement that he would not be part of the machinery of injustice, even as a spectator. From a Stoic perspective, this was not passive at all. It was an intensely active choice within the realm of what was up to him. He controlled his participation, his assent. By withholding that assent, he was performing a just action. He was aligning his conduct with the cosmic law that said a rational being must not cooperate with irrational cruelty. His continued presence in Rome, living freely while embodying this silent reproach, made him a living monument to integrity in a city of fear. He became a standing question mark against the regime's legitimacy. Every day he walked the streets unharmed was a day the emperor's power seemed incomplete. For a tyrant like Nero, such a symbol was intolerable. A noisy enemy can be crushed, but a quiet, unwavering mirror that reflects your own corruption back at you must be shattered. So the regime finally moved against him. The charges at his trial were a masterpiece of political irony. He was accused of neglecting his senatorial duties, of being a poor citizen, and of fostering a gloomy and disapproving demeanor. In essence, he was condemned for the crime of Stoicism itself, for living a life so conspicuously virtuous that it highlighted the vices of the court. His trial was not really about treason, it was about eliminating a moral benchmark. When the verdict of death was delivered, Thrasea accepted it with the same calm discipline he had shown in the Senate. He turned his final moments, like Seneca, into a philosophical demonstration, discussing the immortality of the soul with a philosopher in his home as the officials waited. His end proved that his silent opposition was never about saving his own life, but about defining its meaning on his own terms until the very last breath. This was defiance refined to its essence, not a battle cry, but a sustained, quiet no that echoed long after he was gone. Yet this code of justice would face its ultimate test under an emperor who did not just want submission, but demanded worship. The silence of Thrasea Paetus left a void in the Roman Senate, a void that would soon be filled with a voice of startling and uncompromising clarity. Enter Helvidius Priscus, the son-in-law of Thrasea, a man who inherited not just a family connection, but a philosophical legacy. The era had changed. The mad Nero was gone, replaced by the more stable, pragmatic rule of Vespasian, founder of the Flavian dynasty. This was not a flamboyant tyrant, but a seasoned military commander focused on restoring order and refilling the empire's depleted treasury. For many, this was a welcome relief, a chance to move on. For Helvidius Priscus, it was a new arena in which to test the Stoic code. Where his father-in-law had perfected the art of eloquent silence, Helvidius chose a different tactic: direct, vocal, and relentless confrontation. He believed the Senate itself, that ancient body, had to reclaim its dignity and its constitutional role. His opposition was not against a monster, but against a system that had grown accustomed to its own servitude. This made his defiance in some ways more radical because it challenged not insanity, but the comfortable normalization of power. Helvidius saw Vespasian not as a personal enemy, but as a magistrate of the Roman people, a first among equals who happened to hold supreme military command. In the Stoic Cosmopolis, all rational beings were citizens. In the Roman Republic, which existed now only in memory and principle, all senators were peers. Helvidius fused these two ideas. He insisted on treating the emperor as a fellow citizen, a fellow senator, and holding him to the same standards of law and tradition. This was not mere nostalgia, it was a philosophical stance. If justice meant giving each person their due, then the Senate was due its ancient liberties, and the emperor was due the respect of an office holder, not the worship of a monarch. He acted, therefore, not out of personal animosity, but from a duty to the institution and to the universal law it was supposed to represent. Every speech, every challenge was an attempt to drag reality back into alignment with principle. The clashes were specific and explosive. One major conflict centered on the emperor's right to appoint magistrates without the Senate's formal approval. Vespasian, like his predecessors, simply presented his candidates for ratification, expecting the customary rubber stamp. Helvidius objected not just quietly, but publicly and persistently. He argued that the Senate must genuinely debate and approve these appointments, that this was its sacred right and responsibility. He was essentially demanding that the emperor share a power that had been considered absolute for over a century. On another occasion, he pointedly omitted the customary prayers for the emperor's well-being from his official motions. When questioned, he stated that a good emperor would not need such flattery, and a bad one did not deserve it. The emperor, he said, was the Senate's servant, not its master. Each of these acts was a deliberate provocation, a calculated attempt to rebuild a wall of tradition that had long since crumbled. Vespasian, a practical man, was initially tolerant, even amused. He reportedly remarked that he did not feud with a dead dog, a crude but telling comment about his view of the senator's posturing. But Helvidius was no dog, he was a mirror. His unwavering consistency forced everyone, including the emperor, to see the gap between the republic's ideals and the empire's realities. His refusal to play the game of courtly deference made the obedience of others look like cowardice. For a ruler trying to consolidate a new dynasty, such a persistent, principled critic became a dangerous symbol of resistance. The final break came, according to the histories, over Helvidius's language in the Senate, which grew so openly contemptuous that Vespasian could no longer ignore it. The emperor, the restorer of peace, finally gave the order. Helvidius Priscus was executed. His story underscores a brutal lesson of the Stoic code. It does not calibrate its demands based on the character of the ruler. The duty to justice is absolute, whether facing a Nero or a Vespasian. In fact, opposing a competent, popular emperor like Vespasian required a different, perhaps purer kind of courage. There was no madness to hide behind, no obvious villain to condemn. One was standing against the grain of a society grateful for stability, arguing for a higher law that seemed, to many, like inconvenient obstructionism. Helvidius died not because he fought a monster, but because he refused to stop fighting for an idea, even when the man in charge was reasonable. His execution proved that the code's demand for consistency was unforgiving. It asked for the same integrity in the clear light of a functional administration as it did in the shadows of a tyranny. This raises a final, profound question. What happens when the man holding the absolute power is himself a devoted student of this unforgiving philosophy? These acts of defiance were not solitary rebellions, but the visible peaks of a submerged mountain range. Behind Seneca, Thrasea Paetus, and Helvidius Priscus stood a wider circle, a network of senators, thinkers, and their families now remembered by historians as the Stoic opposition. This was not a formal political party with a headquarters and a manifesto. It was a community bound by a shared philosophy that inevitably shaped their public conduct. Figures like Marcus Aurelius, a respected consul known for his integrity in governing Asia, and Rubelius Plautus, a man of aristocratic lineage who lived quietly in the countryside to avoid Nero's suspicion, were part of this web. A younger senator named Arulenus Rusticus so admired Thrasea that he famously offered as a tribune to veto the death sentence, a gesture Thrasea gently refused to protect the young man from certain ruin. These men were connected by marriage, by friendship, and by the books they read and discussed. They attended the same lectures, exchanged letters, and saw their individual fates as intertwined within a larger moral struggle. What united them was not a plot to seize power, but a shared interpretation of the world. Their Stoicism provided a complete framework for understanding duty, honor, and justice that made the customary compromises of Roman political life seem not just distasteful, but irrational. When one of them walked out of a Senate session or refused to flatter the emperor, it was not merely a personal protest. It was a performance of a shared truth, a signal to the others that the standard was being upheld. This created a cohesive resistance ideology far more dangerous than any conspiracy. A conspiracy can be uncovered and its members eliminated. An ideology, especially one based on personal virtue and public conduct, is viral. It spreads through example. Each act of courage by one member validated the philosophy for all the others, reinforcing their belief that this was the only path for a rational being. The emperors understood this threat on a visceral level. Nero and later Domitian did not see these men as mere political rivals jockeying for position. They perceived them as a fundamental challenge to the very logic of imperial power. A tyrant can rule through fear if everyone acknowledges that fear is the ultimate currency. But what happens when a significant group of the elite declares through their actions that there is a higher currency, that integrity cannot be purchased with threats, and that a good name is more valuable than a long life? This made the Stoic opposition an ideological infection within the body of the state. Their calm acceptance of exile or death was the ultimate subversion. It proved the emperor's most terrible weapons were powerless over a certain kind of soul. This is why the persecution became systematic. It was not enough to remove one man like Thrasea. Under Domitian, years later, Arulenus Rusticus was executed for writing a laudatory biography of Thrasea, and another senator, Hirnius Senecio, was killed for writing one of Helvidius Priscus. The crime was memory. The state sought to erase not just the men but the very record of their alternative example. The goal was to cut the philosophical thread that connected them, to prove that their code led only to oblivion. In this, the emperors failed. The systematic nature of their response was the clearest possible testimony to the power of the network they feared. They were not fighting individuals, they were fighting an idea that refused to die. But the most chilling testimony to the Stoic code's power came from an emperor who saw it not as a nuisance, but as an existential threat. Decades after Vespasian, his younger son Domitian ascended the throne. Where his father had been a gruff, practical soldier, Domitian cultivated an aura of divine, absolute mastery. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, a title that erased any pretense of republican partnership. In this climate of enforced worship, the quiet dignity of the Stoic opposition became not just irritating but treasonous. Their very existence was a living rebuttal to his claim of total authority. So Domitian did what no emperor had done so systematically before. He declared war on philosophy itself. He issued an edict, a formal decree from the state, ordering all philosophers to leave Rome. This was not a targeted political move against a few rivals. It was a blanket condemnation of an entire way of thinking. The charge was not conspiracy or treason in the traditional sense. The specific crimes were philosophy and introducing new customs. Think about the staggering implication of that. To practice a school of thought dedicated to reason, virtue, and justice was now, by imperial decree, a capital offense. It was the state officially branding wisdom as sedition. Domitian understood something profound. The Stoics were not just criticizing his policies, they were upholding an alternative source of legitimacy. Their moral authority, drawn from the cosmic law of nature, stood in direct opposition to his authority, drawn from fear and the sword. Their ideal of libertas was not mere political freedom. It was the inner and outer liberty of a rational citizen, a concept that completely undermined his project of total control. A man who fears exile or death less than he fears a failure of his own character is a man who cannot be ruled. The purge that followed was methodical and symbolic. Arulenus Rusticus, the young tribune who had once offered to save Thrasea, was now an older senator. His crime: he had written a biography praising Thrasea Paetus. Hirnius Senecio was executed for writing a similar work about Helvidius Priscus. Their offense was memory. They had committed the act of preserving and honoring the examples of defiance. By sentencing them to death for putting words on a scroll, Domitian was attempting to sever the chain of inspiration, to prove that the Stoic code led only to silence and oblivion. Other philosophers, like the influential Epictetus, were simply exiled, banished from the city's intellectual heart. The message was clear: in Domitian's Rome, there was no room for a competing moral compass. The state would be the sole arbiter of virtue. This moment reveals the ultimate paradox and the ultimate power of the uncompromising Stoic code. It forced the tyrant's hand into the open. Domitian could not tolerate their existence because their calm integrity was a constant, silent referendum on his reign. By making philosophy a crime, he admitted his deepest fear, that a set of ideas about justice and inner freedom was more dangerous to his rule than any army. The purge was not a sign of the philosophy's weakness, but a terrified acknowledgement of its strength. The state itself had now formally recognized Stoicism as an active, dangerous force for justice, a threat so potent it required eradication by law. Yet within this climate of fear, the most powerful articulation of the Stoic code came from a voice that had known true bondage. Epictetus was not a senator born to privilege, but a former slave. His leg, according to tradition, had been permanently injured by a cruel master. His entire life was a testament to the philosophy he taught, a living demonstration that the most unshakable freedom could be forged in the crucible of absolute dependence. Exiled from Rome by Domitian's decree, he established a simple school in Greece, where his words were recorded by his student Arrian in the works we know as the Discourses and the Enchiridion. In these teachings we find the pure, distilled theoretical engine that powered the opposition's courage. Epictetus did not write political manifestos. He drilled down to the fundamental mechanics of human experience, providing an intellectual toolkit for anyone who wished to be free, regardless of their external circumstances. He began with a simple, devastating question, one that cuts to the core of every struggle for autonomy. Who is your master? For a slave, the answer seemed obvious: the man who owned the deed. For a senator, it might be the emperor who held the power of life and death. But Epictetus redefined mastery entirely. Your true master, he taught, is anyone or anything that controls what you fear and what you desire. If you fear exile, then the emperor who can exile you is your master. If you desire public acclaim, then the crowd that can grant it is your master. Freedom, therefore, is not a political status granted by others. It is an internal condition you achieve by bringing your own fears and desires under the command of your reason. This was the philosophical revolution. It transferred the battlefield from the Senate floor to the human mind. The external master could chain your body or take your property, things not truly your own. But he could never command your judgments, your choices, your moral character, unless you surrendered them to him through your own fear or craving. This teaching reframed the entire conflict with the emperors. When Thrasea Paetus walked out of the Senate, he was demonstrating that his fear of Nero's displeasure was not his master. When Helvidius Priscus spoke truth to Vespasian, he was proving that his desire for imperial favor was not in control. They were exercising the very freedom Epictetus described, the freedom that exists in the space between an external event and your chosen response to it. Epictetus called this the correct use of impressions. An impression, in his terms, is anything that happens to you, a command, an insult, a threat of death. That impression is not up to you, it simply arrives, but your assent to that impression, your judgment about what it means, that is entirely within your power. A tyrant's order is just a sound, a set of words. The impression, he has ordered my death, is unavoidable. The judgment, this is a terrible evil I cannot bear, is optional. The Stoic trains themselves to withhold that automatic, fearful assent. They examine the impression, is this thing truly an evil, or is it merely something outside my control? By refusing to label external threats as ultimate evils, they drain the tyrant's power at its source. His weapons only work if you believe they are terrible. This mental discipline was the ultimate armor. It allowed an individual to face an emperor not with bluster, but with equanimity, because they had already won the more important victory within themselves. Furthermore, Epictetus grounded this personal freedom in a profound sense of social duty. He constantly reminded his students that they were not isolated beings, but citizens of two cities, their local homeland and the great Cosmopolis, the universe itself. As a citizen, you have a role, a character to play. For a senator, that role involved specific duties to uphold justice and speak for the common good. To neglect that duty out of fear was not just personal cowardice, it was a betrayal of your citizenship. He taught, do not seek to have events happen as you want, but want them to happen as they do happen, and your life will go well. This is often misunderstood as passive acceptance. In context, it is a call for clear-eyed, courageous engagement. It means first, see the reality before you, a corrupt emperor, a cowed senate. That is the event. Now, given that reality, what does your role as a rational citizen demand of you? It may demand a protest, a refusal, a costly stand. Wanting events to happen as they do means accepting that this stand is what your virtue requires in this moment, and embracing that duty without resentment toward the reality that makes it necessary. Epictetus provided the theoretical backbone for every act of defiance we have witnessed. He turned philosophy from a subject of study into a manual for survival and integrity. His life, from physical slavery to intellectual liberation, proved that the code was not an aristocratic luxury. It was a universal key to a freedom no emperor could ever take away. Yet the most famous Stoic of them all never faced execution or exile. He sat on the throne. Marcus Aurelius, the last of Rome's so-called 5 good emperors, presents history's most profound paradox. Here was a man who wielded absolute power while privately writing one of the most revered texts on humility, self-discipline, and justice, a personal journal we know as the Meditations. While the Stoic opposition died defying emperors, Marcus Aurelius lived as one, wrestling daily with the crushing weight of the office. His inner world, revealed in those pages, is a storm of self-admonition. He constantly reminds himself to rise before dawn, to do the work of a human being, to tolerate the ignorant and the obstinate, for they too are his kin in the Cosmopolis. He writes not as a triumphant ruler, but as a man trying to hold himself to an impossible standard. The central tension of his life and of his philosophy is glaring. How does one practice the Stoic code of justice, which demands giving each person their due, when you are the final arbiter of what that due is for millions? How do you maintain the view from above, seeing the world as a single city, while leading armies to kill and subjugate those seen as threats to that city's borders? His meditations are the record of that struggle. He served as emperor during relentless military crises, spending years on the turbulent frontiers fighting Germanic tribes and a resurgent Parthian empire. In his personal notes, he frames this not as a quest for glory, but as a duty, a burden he must bear with patience and without personal malice toward his enemies. He sees himself as a bee in a hive performing his appointed task for the whole. This is where we must judge his adherence to the code, not just in his private thoughts, but in his public actions. In some areas, his reign reflected Stoic principles clearly. He was renowned for his deep involvement in the legal system, aiming to make it more humane and accessible. He strengthened protections for orphans and slaves, and he spent imperial funds to support children of impoverished families. He displayed notable clemency, pardoning confirmed conspirators against his life and showing restraint in victory. These were not the acts of a tyrant, but of a ruler consciously trying to apply the virtue of justice to the mechanics of governance, to see his subjects as fellow citizens deserving of fairness. Yet the shadow side of his rule cannot be ignored. During his reign, persecutions of Christians continued and in some regions intensified. From a Stoic perspective, this presents a difficult contradiction. The philosophy taught tolerance for differing opinions, seeing error as a form of ignorance, not malice. The Cosmopolis was meant to include all rational beings. While the persecutions were often driven by local officials and popular prejudice rather than direct imperial command, Marcus Aurelius, as the supreme authority, ultimately bore responsibility for maintaining a system that allowed such injustice. His own writings show a disdain for the theatricality of Christian martyrdom, which he saw as obstinacy, but they reveal no deep commitment to protecting a misunderstood minority. This was a failure to extend the Stoic ideal of universal citizenship to a group he did not comprehend. Then there is the most fateful decision of his life, one that seems to betray the very core of Stoic meritocracy. Against all advice and breaking the tradition of adoptive succession that had given Rome its best rulers, he named his biological son, Commodus, as his heir. Commodus was notoriously unfit, more interested in gladiatorial spectacle than statecraft. Marcus chose familial love and dynastic tradition over the clear good of the commonwealth. He placed the needs of his son above the needs of the Cosmopolis. This single act would plunge the empire back into the kind of tyrannical rule his philosophical predecessors had died opposing. It is the great stain on his Stoic legacy, a vivid example of where personal attachment overrode philosophical principle. So what does Marcus Aurelius's life tell us about the Stoic code? He proves that the code is most difficult not when you are opposing power, but when you are its source. The external enemy is easy to identify. The enemy within the palace, the enemy in the mirror of absolute authority, is far harder to confront. His meditations are so powerful precisely because they are the notes of a man trying, and sometimes failing, to use the philosophy as a compass from the most disorienting position imaginable. He embodies the paradox that the Stoic text most celebrated for its wisdom came from the seat of power, while the philosophy's most dramatic and pure expressions of justice came from those who had nothing but their integrity to wield against that power. In Marcus, we see the code internalized as a constant, grinding self-interrogation. In the opposition, we saw it externalized as fearless action. Both were essential to the philosophy's terrifying, beautiful demand that we align our lives with a law greater than any emperor. This internal process was not a vague feeling, but a precise mental operation. We can reconstruct the exact steps a Stoic like Thrasea Paetus would have walked through when faced with an emperor's unjust command. It begins not with emotion, but with a cold, clear perception. The first question is one of alignment. Is this decree, this demand for applause, or this order to condemn an innocent man in accordance with the rational law of the Cosmopolis? Does it serve justice and the common good of all rational beings? The answer is not a matter of personal opinion, but of philosophical fact. If the action promotes cruelty, fear, or the selfish gain of one man over the welfare of the community, it is, by definition, out of harmony with nature. This initial perception is the crucial filter. It separates what the world presents from what the Stoic soul can accept. The next step is the decisive pivot of the entire system, the act of ascent. This is where Epictetus's teaching becomes a life-saving skill. An impression floods the mind: the emperor is powerful, his guards are at the door, my family is at risk, compliance is the safe path. The untrained mind immediately assents to these impressions, labeling them as ultimate truths and terrifying necessities. The Stoic, however, practices a disciplined pause. He withholds his assent. He examines the impression like a scientist examining a specimen. He asks, is this external threat truly an evil, or is it merely something outside my control? Is the impression that I must obey to survive actually true? Or is there another option that my reason can see? By refusing to automatically agree that the emperor's will is the final word on reality, he reclaims his mental sovereignty. He says no internally before he ever says no externally. Only after this internal work is complete does action enter the picture. The choice of what to do flows naturally from the first two steps. Having perceived the action as unjust and having withheld assent from the fear it creates, the Stoic now asks, what action aligns my character with justice? The answer is not always a dramatic shout. It could be the vocal opposition of Helvidius Priscus, challenging the emperor in open senate. It could be the silent, eloquent withdrawal of Thrasea Paetus, physically removing his presence from a corrupt proceeding. Or it could be the simple, steadfast refusal to perform a specific unjust act. The form of the action is tailored to the circumstance, but its source is always the same, a will now aligned with the cosmic law. This turns defiance from a reckless impulse into the most rational thing a person can do. It is not rebellion for its own sake, but coherence on a universal scale. Finally, with the chosen action taken, the Stoic turns to the consequences. Here lies the ultimate freedom. The emperor's reaction, whether it is exile, confiscation of property, or a sentence of death, belongs to the realm of externals, the things not up to us. The Stoic meets these outcomes with indifference, not in the sense of not caring, but in the precise philosophical sense of judging them as having no moral weight. They cannot make the virtuous action less virtuous, nor can they corrupt the soul that chose it. To accept exile with calm, or to face the end with composure as Seneca did, is the final demonstration that the code has worked. It proves that the individual's worth was never tied to the things the tyrant could take away. The entire process, from perception to peaceful acceptance, forms a complete circuit of integrity. It transforms a moment of terrifying political pressure into a demonstration of unassailable inner logic. This was the invisible machinery behind every public act of courage, the silent calculus that made their loudest silences speak volumes. This unbreakable consistency carried a price, paid not in coin, but in the very substance of a life. For the Stoic opponent, exile was a punishment of profound philosophical dimensions. It was not merely a change of address or a loss of comfortable surroundings. In the Roman world, to be exiled was to be stripped of your dignitas, your public standing, and severed from your active role in the political community. Remember, the Stoic code viewed each person as a citizen with duties. Exile was a forcible amputation from the body where those duties were performed. It was a declaration that your voice, your vote, your very presence was no longer part of the civic conversation. For a man like Rubellius Plautus, who withdrew to his estates in Asia to avoid Nero's suspicion, this quiet life away from Rome was still a form of internal exile, a removal from the arena where his virtues were meant to engage. The hardship was not about missing the city's luxuries, but about being rendered inert, unable to fulfill the social aspect of justice that his philosophy demanded. It was a living contradiction to be a citizen of the universal Cosmopolis, yet banned from participating in your own local city-state. They endured this not as a vacation, but as a sustained test of their commitment to inner virtue when all external roles had been stolen away. Their final act, when it came, was the ultimate expression of that inner control. The Stoic good death was a carefully orchestrated performance of reason. It was meant to be a deliberate, conscious choice, free from panic, theater, or regret. When Seneca opened his veins, he turned the procedure into a philosophical seminar, dictating his final thoughts to scribes. When Thrasea Paetus received the sentence, he calmly discussed the nature of the soul with a philosopher as the officials waited in his home. This was radically different from the traditional Roman aristocratic view of suicide, which was often a desperate escape from shame or a political maneuver to preserve family honor and property. The Roman noble might fall on his sword to avoid the disgrace of a public execution, but his act was fundamentally reactive, a last move in a game he had lost. The Stoics' death was proactive. It was the final, logical application of the dichotomy of control. Since they could not control the emperor's sentence, they took absolute command over the manner of their departure. They transformed the tyrant's victory into a platform for their own unwavering principles. By meeting the end with serene composure, they demonstrated that the one thing the state could not touch was their moral character. This turned the executioner's blade into a mirror, reflecting the emperor's brutality against the philosopher's peace. In this light, their deaths were not defeats but devastating propaganda. A noisy rebel who curses his fate confirms the tyrant's power to create fear. A silent philosopher who thanks his friends and discusses eternal truths in his final moments exposes that power as an empty shell. The very calm of their passing was an indictment. It broadcast a simple, terrifying message to the empire. Here is a man who possesses something you cannot take, something you do not even understand. This act of supreme consistency immortalized their stand far more effectively than any victory in the Senate could have. It etched their example into the memory of the age, creating a legend that no imperial edict could erase. The proof of this lies in what happened after the tyrants fell. Following Nero's death, and more decisively after Domitian's assassination, the Roman Senate eagerly rehabilitated the memories of these men. The works praising Thrasea and Helvidius, for which their biographers had been executed, were now publicly celebrated. Their statues were restored. They were posthumously declared heroes of the Republic's virtues. This was not merely a political reversal. It was a collective admission that their code had judged the era, and the era had been found wanting. The tyrants died hated and damned, their names cursed by history. The philosophers they killed died as permanent symbols of a freedom that outlasts any throne. Their legacy was not written in laws they passed, but in the unbearable standard of integrity they set, a standard that forced every subsequent generation to ask, which side of that line would I stand on? But who would remember their names if no one dared to write them down? The stories of this defiance did not survive by accident. They were preserved by two men who witnessed the terror firsthand and understood that history itself was the final battlefield. The senators Tacitus and Pliny the Younger were not just observers, they were participants who navigated the same dangerous currents. Both men built public careers under Domitian's oppressive reign, a period Tacitus would later call a time of silent, servile peace, where it was dangerous to be known as an honest man. They saw friends and mentors destroyed, and when Domitian fell, they undertook a profound act of recovery. Their writings, Tacitus' monumental annals and histories, and Pliny's published letters, became the vessel that carried the Stoic opposition from oblivion into permanent memory. These are not neutral records, they are testaments shaped by the very philosophical ideals they describe, making the writing of history an extension of the Stoic struggle for justice. Tacitus opens his annals with a declaration of purpose that echoes like a Stoic mantra. He states his intent is to make a record, without anger or partisan feeling, of brutal orders, unceasing prosecutions, treacherous friendships, the ruin of innocent men, and the same causes leading to the same end. Why chronicle such a grim catalogue? His answer is piercing, so that virtue not be silenced. In that simple phrase, he links his pen directly to the actions of Thrasea and Helvidius. Their public defiance was one form of witness, his historical account is another. Both are acts of resistance against the emperor's ultimate goal, which was not just to kill men, but to erase the meaning of their deaths, to make virtue appear futile and silent. By writing it all down, Tacitus ensures the silence is broken for all time. He turns the Senate's fearful complicity and the philosophers' lonely courage into an eternal dialogue. His prose is famously dense, sharp, and ironic, a literary reflection of the Stoic practice of examining impressions. He presents the facts, the brutal orders, the theatrical flattery, the damning votes, and lets the reader's own reason, just like a Stoic progressor, draw the judgment of good and evil. He makes you see the corruption not through a rant, but through a cold, clear lens, training you in the very skill of perception the philosophers themselves used. Pliny the Younger provides a more personal, but equally vital perspective. His letters show us how the Stoic ideal was integrated into the daily life of a Roman gentleman after the terror had passed. He writes glowing tributes to the executed Helvidius Priscus, helps secure a pension for his daughter, and actively works to restore the reputations of the condemned. In one famous letter, he describes his own strategy under Domitian, attending the Senate but saying nothing of consequence, a careful, compromised survival that makes the outright defiance of the Stoic heroes shine even brighter by contrast. Pliny does not claim their mantle, he holds it up for admiration. His correspondence is a manual for rebuilding a society based on honorable friendship and public service, the very social virtues the Stoic code demanded. Together, these historians performed the last duty of the Cosmopolis. They ensured that the record of who gave what to whom, which is the core of justice, was preserved. The emperors could confiscate property and burn books, but they could not unwrite the truth once it was etched into the narrative of the age. By choosing what to remember and how to remember it, Tacitus and Pliny turned history from a list of events into a moral argument. They proved that the pen, wielded with Stoic integrity, could have the final word over the sword, securing a victory over oblivion that no tyrant could ever overturn. Their legacy forces a difficult question. Did any of it truly matter? From a purely political standpoint, the Stoic opposition's record looks like a catalogue of noble failures. They did not restore the Roman Republic. They did not prevent the rise of a Nero or a Domitian. Their symbolic withdrawals and principled deaths did not reform the imperial system. One could argue their methods were, in the end, powerless. A tyrant might be momentarily irritated by a senator's silence, but the machinery of state rolled on unimpeded. So were they merely performing a beautiful, futile gesture? To answer that, we must step fully into their worldview and understand what they believed constituted real success. For the Stoic, the primary battlefield was never the Senate floor or the emperor's court. It was the integrity of their own soul. Political outcomes, whether a law was passed or a regime changed, belonged to the realm of externals, the vast category of things not up to them. To judge their actions by that external metric is to apply a standard they explicitly rejected. Their goal was not guaranteed political victory, a thing impossible to control. Their goal was to maintain their own virtue, to live and die in accordance with the rational law of the Cosmopolis. In that precise, demanding objective, they succeeded completely. Every refusal, every quiet exit, every calm acceptance of a sentence was a victory of the will. It was proof that a human being could face the absolute power of the Roman state and remain unbroken in the only place that ultimately counted, their own moral character. But this was not a private, self-absorbed triumph. Their second aim was to provide a witness. In a world drowning in fear and flattery, they became living and then dying testimonies to a different truth. They testified that there is a law higher than an emperor's command. They testified that a life can be measured by something other than its length or its comforts. They testified that fear is not the final word on human possibility. This act of witness was their public service. It was a form of communication aimed not at the emperor, who was often beyond reach, but at their peers, at the historical record, and at future generations. They were planting a seed in the consciousness of the age, a seed that might lay dormant for years under the hard frost of tyranny, but one that could later germinate when the climate changed. Their impact, therefore, was not measured in immediate policy shifts, but in the moral and historical record. They established a standard. They drew a line in the sand of human conduct and said, "This far and no further." They created an alternative script for how to be a Roman in an age of servility. This is why the work of Tacitus and Pliny was so vital. It captured and preserved that standard, turning individual acts into a permanent legacy. Centuries later, their example would resonate with thinkers and resistors facing their own empires and tyrannies, because they articulated a form of resistance that transcends its original context. It is a resistance based not on weapons or numbers, but on the unconquerable territory of a principled mind. So, could they have done more from a modern activist perspective, perhaps? But to ask them to have done more by compromising their philosophical core would be to ask them to cease being Stoics. Their power was inextricable from their purity of method. The silent walkout, the refusal to vote, the calm death, these were the direct, logical expressions of their code. To expect them to organize a popular revolt or an assassination plot would be to expect them to adopt the very tools of violence and irrationality their philosophy condemned. They fought tyranny with the only weapons their world sanctioned: reason, consistency, and an absolute commitment to justice as they understood it. Their limitation was also their strength. It defined the unique and enduring nature of their rebellion, one that continues to challenge us not with a blueprint for political change, but with a far more personal and unsettling question. What line would you refuse to cross, even if crossing it was the only path to safety? This stark question of ultimate purpose brings another group of resistors into sharp focus. During the very same decades when Stoic senators were defying emperors, a different community across the Roman Empire was also facing state execution with astonishing calm: the early Christians. To an outside observer in first-century Rome, the deaths of a Thrasea Paetus and a Christian prisoner might have looked remarkably similar, a serene individual meeting a brutal state punishment without fear. Yet beneath that surface courage, the philosophical engines driving them were worlds apart. Both groups shared a profound contempt for worldly power, seeing the emperor's authority as secondary to a higher, absolute truth. Both turned their final moments into a deliberate performance, using death itself as a powerful statement. But their reasons for standing firm, and the nature of the truth they died for, created two fundamentally different models of defiance. For the Christian, the core motivation was faith in a divine revelation. Their higher law was not discovered through reason and observation of the cosmos, but received through Scripture and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Their commitment was to a personal God who had entered history, promising eternal salvation and resurrection to those who remained faithful. The ultimate good was not a life lived in harmony with nature, but a soul saved for eternity in heaven. This transcendent hope fundamentally reshaped their relationship to suffering and death. Persecution was not merely a test of character. It was an imitation of Christ's own sacrifice, a path to heavenly reward. The martyr's death was a triumphant passage, a victory over Satan and the fallen world. Their calmness sprang from the certainty of a divine promise that lay beyond the grave. The Stoic, by contrast, was driven by a rational commitment to a cosmic order they believed was discoverable by any thinking mind. Their higher law was the logos, the intelligent principle woven into the fabric of the universe itself. There was no divine revelation of specific commands, no promise of an afterlife. The Stoics studied the world, studied human nature, and through logic deduced a code for living. The ultimate good was virtue, the excellence of a rational soul living in accordance with that cosmic law, right here and now. Their calmness in the face of death sprang not from hope for a reward, but from the judgment that death is a natural event, neither good nor bad, and that a life ended with integrity is a life completed. For them, a good death was the final, flawless note in a life lived coherently. This divergence in motivation led to a crucial difference in the form their defiance took. Christian martyrdom was often a refusal to participate in the Roman system's core rituals. The classic point of conflict was the demand to offer a pinch of incense to the emperor's genius, a symbolic act of civic loyalty. For a Christian, this was idolatry, a betrayal of the first commandment. Their defiance was therefore a withdrawal, a saying no to an act of worship they believed was forbidden. They stood outside the political community, declaring a primary allegiance to a heavenly kingdom. Their protest was centrifugal, pushing away from the center of Roman civic life. The Stoics' defiance, however, was an attempt at active participation aimed at correction. Thrasea Paetus, Helvidius Priscus, and their circle were not trying to leave the Roman system. They were trying to fulfill its highest republican ideals. They were senators, judges, governors, men deeply embedded in the machinery of the state. Their protest was not a refusal to perform a ritual, but a refusal to perform their duties badly. They walked out of the Senate not to reject the Senate itself, but to reject the corruption of its proceedings. Their defiance was centripetal, striving to pull the political community back toward its own professed virtues, back into alignment with the natural law of justice. They were not outsiders declaring the system evil. They were insiders trying to repair it from within, using its own language of honor and duty. Both paths required breathtaking courage and left a permanent mark on Western thought. The Christian martyr witnessed to a truth beyond reason, while the Stoic senator witnessed to a truth discovered by reason. One looked to a city of God, the other to a cosmopolis of rational beings. Their parallel stands in the Roman arena present us with a timeless tableau, two distinct ways a human spirit can find a strength greater than the power that seeks to break it. This modern preference for tranquility over justice has reshaped Stoicism into something its founders would scarcely recognize. We see it repackaged today, often stripped of its demanding social core and presented as a sleek toolkit for personal optimization. The focus narrows to a single, appealing slice of the philosophy, the dichotomy of control. We are taught to master our reactions, to cultivate an inner fortress against life's slings and arrows, to accept what we cannot change. And this is not wrong, it is a vital part of the system. But when it becomes the entire system, the philosophy is turned inside out. The goal subtly shifts from living a just life to maintaining a calm one. The modern practitioner, sometimes called the corporate Stoic, applies these techniques to endure a toxic workplace, to manage stress from overwhelming demands, to accept market volatility with equanimity. The philosophy becomes a means of weathering an unjust system, not a call to rectify it. This is Stoicism as a life raft, when it was designed to be a compass for navigating the storm itself. The ancient Stoic would ask a piercing question of this approach: where is your justice? If your tranquility is built on tolerating or ignoring clear wrongdoing, if your acceptance means looking away from harm, then what you have is not virtue, but a carefully managed complicity. You have successfully controlled your emotional impressions, but you have failed in your duty as a citizen of the Cosmopolis. The historical figures we have followed understood this distinction perfectly. For Seneca, tranquility was not found by ignoring Nero's growing corruption, but by finally confronting the cost of his own association with it. His retirement and later his death were profoundly disruptive to his peace, yet they were necessary acts of moral alignment. For Thrasea Paetus, peace of mind could have been easily purchased with a few votes of approval in the Senate. Instead, he chose the inner turmoil of public dissent, the anxiety of being a marked man because justice demanded that price. Their pursuit of the good life was not a search for quiet contentment. It was a commitment to right action, even when that action shattered any chance of personal peace. The ancient code was at its heart activist. It compelled engagement. The famous Stoic mantra, "Love the fate," is often recited as a passive surrender to events. But in its full context, it is a command for vigorous participation. It means, first, see the reality clearly. A tyrant is in power, an injustice is occurring. Then, given that reality, ask what your role as a rational being requires you to do. Loving your fate might mean accepting that your role, in this moment, is to speak up and face the consequences, to embrace that difficult duty as the very thing your character needs to grow. The tranquility they sought was not the absence of conflict, but the integrity that comes from knowing you have done what is right, regardless of the external chaos it provokes. This is the stark choice we inherit from their legacy. Will we use this philosophy as a cushion or as a catalyst? This uncompromising code of justice can be distilled into 5 specific tenets, the precise philosophical engine that made defiance not just an option, but a requirement. The first is the concept of the Cosmopolis. For the Stoic, your primary allegiance was never to Rome or to any single nation, but to the universal community of all rational beings, the city of gods and men. This meant that any local law or imperial command had to be measured against this higher, natural law. An emperor's decree that violated justice was, by definition, an illegitimate order from a fellow citizen who had lost his way. Your duty was to the wider community first. The second tenet is the unity of virtue. Wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice are not separate qualities you can pick and choose. They are completely inseparable, like 4 sides of a single, unbreakable block. You cannot be truly wise if you use your knowledge to exploit others, because that is a failure of justice. You cannot be truly courageous if your bravery serves a cruel cause. To sacrifice justice for personal safety is to shatter the entire structure of your character. The virtues stand or fall together. Third is the direction of the sage. Since a perfectly wise human is as rare as a mythical bird, the Stoic does not aim for perfection. They use the ideal of the sage as a compass. In any difficult situation, the question is not what feels easiest, but what would the perfectly rational being do? That hypothetical action provides the true north for moral navigation. It turns an impossible standard into a practical guide for every choice, especially the hard ones. Fourth is the control of action. The famous Stoic dichotomy teaches that while we cannot control outcomes, we always control our own choices and actions. Speaking truth, refusing to cooperate with corruption, voting your conscience, these are exercises of the will, fully within your power. The emperor controls the prison cell, but he does not control your decision to walk into it with your head held high. Your virtuous action is always up to you. The fifth and final tenet is the indifference to externals. This is often misunderstood. It does not mean you do not care about your life, your family, or your home. It means you judge these things as having no moral weight compared to your integrity. Death, exile, disgrace, these are merely external events, neither good nor bad in themselves. They only become evils if you choose to fear them more than you value acting justly. If you incur them while upholding the Cosmopolis, then they are simply the price of citizenship, to be met with calm acceptance. Together, these 5 tenets form a self-reinforcing system. The Cosmopolis defines your duty, The unity of virtue makes that duty non-negotiable. The sage's direction shows you the path. The control of action puts the first step in your hands, and the indifference to externals frees you to take it. This is the engine that powered every silent walkout and every calm farewell. Their defiance was a language spoken not only in words but in the very posture of a life. In a world where public image was the currency of power, the Stoic opposition mastered a different kind of oratory, one composed of silence, composure, and deliberate action. Every gesture was a calculated performance, a piece of rhetoric aimed at an audience far wider than the emperor himself. Think of the Roman public sphere as a vast stage. Senators performed their loyalty through flattering speeches, citizens performed their allegiance through cheers at games, and the emperor performed his divinity through spectacle and ritual. Into this theater, the Stoics introduced a new and disruptive script. Their performance was not about affirming the regime's power, but about exposing its moral emptiness. When Thrasea Paetus rose from his senatorial chair and walked out of the chamber, he was delivering a speech more eloquent than any he could have shouted. His exit was a physical argument. In a body that demanded unanimity, his solitary departure created a visible crack in the facade. It said, "I see what is happening here, and I will not be a part of it." The message was not lost on anyone in the room. His silence was not an absence of communication, but a potent form of it, a refusal to lend his voice to a corrupt proceeding. This was rhetoric of the body, a statement written in motion and stillness. Seneca transformed his final moments into a meticulously staged lesson. The scene in his villa, with the opened veins and the dictation of final thoughts to scribes, was not a chaotic end. It was a deliberate demonstration of the philosophy he had spent a lifetime teaching. He was showing, in the most visceral way possible, what it meant to exercise control over the one thing truly his own, his exit from life. By turning his death into a philosophical discourse, he robbed the emperor's order of its intended terror. Nero meant to punish and erase a critic. Seneca reframed the event as a voluntary act of a free man, a final lecture on liberty. The audience for this performance was his circle of friends, the historical record, and ultimately, us. He was making the abstract concept of Stoic indifference to externals terrifyingly tangible. You could see it in the steady hand, hear it in the calm voice. The performance proved the philosophy worked, not in the comfort of a lecture hall, but under the extreme pressure of a death sentence. Helvidius Priscus chose the more traditional weapon of words, but wielded them with a precision designed to dismantle the courtly language of the era. His speeches in the Senate were not mere complaints. They were forensic exercises applying the clear, rational standards of the Cosmopolis to the muddy realities of imperial politics. By insisting on calling Vespasian a citizen and a senator, he was stripping away the mystical aura of the throne and reducing power to a human office with human responsibilities. When he omitted the customary prayers for the emperor's well-being, he was breaking a ritual code. In a society where such rituals reinforced the social order, his omission was a deafening statement. It declared that true respect must be earned through just conduct, not demanded through ceremonial flattery. His rhetoric was a tool for redefining reality, forcing everyone to see the emperor not as a god, but as a magistrate who could be held to account. This public performance was for them an essential part of their duty. As prominent figures, their lives were inherently visible. To practice Stoicism only in private would have been a philosophical contradiction. If justice is a social virtue, then it must be enacted in the social sphere. Their composure in crisis, their refusal to panic or plead, was a signal to other potential resistors. It was a rallying point for the virtuous, a quiet proof that fear was not invincible. In shaming the tyranny, they were not expressing personal anger, but holding up a mirror to the state's own betrayal of its ideals. They made their philosophy visible, turning their own bodies and choices into living arguments for a law higher than Rome's. This transformed their defiance from personal sacrifice into public communication, a legacy written not on scrolls alone, but in the unforgettable memory of how a free person stands, speaks, and departs. The emperor's throne was not just a seat of command, it was the ultimate source of reality for the Roman world. Every honor, every law, every life and death flowed from his will. To challenge that will was treason, but to challenge the very source of his legitimacy was something far more dangerous. From the palace, the Stoic senator was not merely a political rival. He was a philosophical virus, introducing a competing operating system into the empire's machinery of control. His authority did not come from imperial appointment, family lineage, or military rank. It came from nature and reason, a power source the emperor could not touch, regulate, or bestow. Imagine the unsettling presence of such a man in the Senate. While others bowed for favors or trembled at threats, he stood with a posture of calm self-possession. He was not against the emperor because he sought the throne for himself. He was against the emperor's actions because they violated a law written into the stars. This shifted the entire battlefield. Political opponents could be bought with promotions, placated with titles, or crushed with armies. Their motives were comprehensible within the game of power. But how do you bargain with a man whose currency is virtue? How do you intimidate someone who has rationally concluded that exile is merely a change of scenery and death is a natural return to the elements? The Stoics' independence made him unbribable because the things you could offer, wealth, status, safety, were things his philosophy taught him to regard as indifferent, as preferred but ultimately hollow compared to integrity. More frighteningly, he was unintimidatable. The tools of terror rely on a universal human script, the instinct to preserve one's life and comfort at all costs. The Stoic had rewritten that script through years of mental discipline. He had rehearsed losing everything in his mind. When the guards arrived, he was not confronting a new horror. He was meeting a familiar thought experiment he had already accepted. This rendered the state's ultimate weapon psychologically inert. You cannot break a man who does not believe he can be broken. This explains the peculiar, almost excessive violence of the imperial response. It was not proportional to any physical threat these philosophers posed. They raised no armies, they orchestrated no coups. Their threat was entirely ideological, and therefore required an ideological eradication. Executing a Stoic like Thrasea Paetus was not enough. The state had to kill the idea he represented, to prove that his alternative source of authority was a fantasy. This is why the charges were so telling, neglecting senatorial duty, fostering a gloomy demeanor. The crime was living a life that made a silent, unanswerable argument. It was performance art that shamed the audience. When Domitian later exiled all philosophers, he was admitting this fear on a grand scale. He was declaring that a way of thinking, a commitment to a cosmic law, was a seditious act. The purge was a desperate attempt to reset the terms of reality, to assert that the emperor's will was the only legitimate source of truth, value, and honor in the world. Every execution was a message, not just to the Senate, but to every citizen, that the only safe path was to derive your worth from the center of power. The Stoics' calm death turned that message upside down, demonstrating that a human being could anchor their worth in something eternal, leaving the throne looking strangely small and temporary by comparison. But this struggle was not confined to the marble halls of the Senate. The Stoic code of justice flowed through the veins of entire households, finding powerful expression in the women who stood beside and often behind these defiant men. Their stories add a crucial, often overlooked dimension to this history, revealing that the philosophical resistance was a network of families, not just a club of senators. Consider Aurea, the wife of a senator named Thrasea Paetus. When her husband was implicated in a plot and ordered to take his own life, he hesitated. According to the historian Pliny the Younger, Aurea took the dagger, plunged it into her own chest, pulled it out, and handed it to her husband with the now immortal words, "Paetus, it does not hurt." Her act was not a gesture of despair, but a stunning demonstration of Stoic courage and partnership. She showed that the indifference to externals, even to one's own life, was not a theoretical concept, but a lived reality that could guide the hardest choice. She was connected to Thrasea Paetus's circle, and her legendary composure became a benchmark of philosophical fortitude for the entire opposition, a story they would tell to steel their own resolve. Then there was Fania, the wife of Helvidius Priscus. Her defiance was of a different, sustained kind. After her husband was executed by Vespasian, she preserved his writings and his memory, a dangerous act of loyalty. Years later, under Emperor Domitian, her quiet guardianship erupted into open risk. She actively encouraged Hirnius Senecio to write the biography of her late husband, the very work that would lead to Senecio's execution and her own exile. When put on trial, she was asked why she had given the author such dangerous materials. Her reported reply was simple and devastating: "Because he was my husband." For Fania, justice was not an abstract principle debated in the forum. It was the daily duty of memory, of refusing to let a tyrant erase the meaning of a loved one's life. Her exile was the price she paid for upholding that personal and philosophical truth, proving that the consequences of the code reached into the most intimate spaces of the home. These women and others like them were not merely passive sufferers of their husbands' fates, they were active participants in the philosophical network. They hosted discussions, protected scrolls, and provided the emotional and intellectual solidarity that made such dangerous stands possible. When a senator like Thrasea or Helvidius walked into the Senate, he carried with him the strength of a household that shared his values. The women managed estates in their husbands' absences, defended their family's honor after their deaths, and ensured that the children understood why their fathers had acted as they did. They turned the household into a sanctuary for the very ideas the state sought to crush. In doing so, they demonstrated that the Stoic ideal of the Cosmopolis, the universal city of rational beings, inherently included them. Their rationality, their courage, and their capacity for justice were just as vital as any senators. Their endurance through loss, exile, and persecution was a quiet, relentless form of the same defiance. It was a proof that the philosophy's roots ran deep, nourishing a resilience that could outlast any single act of political theater. While history books often spotlight the men who fell in the Senate, the legacy they died for was often kept alive by the women who returned to empty homes and chose every day to remember. Domitian's reign of terror ended with a dagger in a palace corridor. His assassination in the year 96 was less a political revolution and more a collective exhale, a sudden release of pressure that had built for 15 years. The Senate, which had lived in such profound fear, now erupted in a frenzy of symbolic revenge. They ordered his statues torn down, his name chiseled from public monuments, and his memory officially condemned. It was a ritual cleansing, and in that new space a deliberate project of recovery began. The elderly Senator Nerva, chosen as a safe interim ruler, and his formidable successor Trajan, ushered in what later historians would call the era of the 5 good emperors. Their first order of business was not just to change policies, but to repair the soul of the state. This meant publicly reversing Domitian's most infamous decrees. The edict banishing philosophers was rescinded. Exiles like Epictetus were free to return, though many, having built new schools abroad, chose to stay and teach in their hard-won freedom. More importantly, a formal process of rehabilitation began for the men Domitian had executed. The Senate passed posthumous decrees restoring the good names of Helvidius Priscus, Arulenus Rusticus, and Hirnius Senecio. Properties confiscated from their families were returned. Most symbolically, the books that had been their death sentences, the biographies praising Thrasea Paetus and Helvidius were not just permitted, they were actively republished and circulated. The dangerous manuscripts hidden in attics and under floorboards were now brought into the light, their contents celebrated as literature of liberty. This was not merely a political reversal, it was a profound historical vindication. The state itself was now endorsing the very ideas it had recently tried to eradicate. The martyrs were no longer traitors but heroes. Their quiet defiance, once a capital crime, was now held up as a model of lost republican virtue. For survivors like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, who had witnessed the terror, this moment was saturated with a bitter, triumphant meaning. Tacitus, who began writing his histories under this new climate, saw in this rehabilitation a validation of the entire Stoic struggle. He wrote that his purpose was to ensure that virtue would not be silenced, and the Republic's history would not be forgotten. The return of the philosophers' books and the restoration of their honor was, to him, living proof. It showed that while tyranny could muzzle a generation, it could not permanently erase the record of principled resistance. The judgment of history, given time, would always side with those who acted for justice, not for power. The era of the 5 good emperors that followed represented a tentative, fragile reconciliation between absolute power and philosophical ideals. These emperors, from Nerva through Marcus Aurelius, generally ruled with a sense of duty and restraint absent in their predecessors. They consulted the Senate with at least a show of respect. They promoted administrators based on merit. They built libraries and supported intellectual life. In many ways, they attempted to govern as the Stoic opposition had hoped an emperor might govern, as a first servant of the state, a citizen among citizens in the Cosmopolis. Trajan, for instance, was famously handed a sword by the Senate upon his accession with the words, "Use this for us if we rule well, and against us if we rule badly." The gesture was deeply symbolic, an acknowledgement that power was a trust, not a possession. This period demonstrated that the Stoic code was not inherently anti-imperial. It was a standard for how power should be exercised, a demand for accountability to a law higher than whim. The vindication of the martyrs under these emperors sent a clear message to future rulers. The spirit of Thrasea and Helvidius was now part of the empire's official conscience. Their ghosts stood as permanent witnesses, a reminder that the throne's legitimacy depended on its justice. This posthumous victory, however, was shadowed by a deep irony. The men who had died for these principles never saw this world. Their vindication came only after they were gone, enjoyed by their families and celebrated by historians. Their courage was an act of faith, a belief that the arc of the cosmos bent toward justice, even if they would not live to see it bend. They planted trees whose shade they knew they would never sit under. This is the ultimate, sobering lesson of their rehabilitation. The code they followed did not promise success or safety, or even contemporary acclaim. It promised only that living with integrity was its own reward, and that planting the seed of truth was a duty regardless of the harvest. The fact that a later, better age recognized that seed for what it was, that is the vindication that echoes across centuries, a whisper from the past assuring us that some lines, once drawn in the sand of human courage, are never truly erased. This internal resolution of duty points directly to the most dangerous question a Stoic senator could face. Was his ultimate loyalty to Rome or to a higher law? The traditional Roman code was built on a sacred hierarchy, the Pietas owed to family, gods, and fatherland, with the emperor standing as the living embodiment of the state's authority. To defy him was not just political dissent, it was an act of impiety, a rupture in the very fabric of social order. This created a profound internal conflict for a man like Thrasea Paetus, who was both a devoted Roman and a committed Stoic. How could he reconcile his philosophical duty to justice with his ancestral duty of loyalty? The Stoic framework did not dismiss this tension. it resolved it with a breathtaking redefinition of terms. It drew a line between the temporary, earthly institution of the Roman state and the eternal, rational principle of the res publica, the commonwealth. The true res publica, in their view, was not the bricks of the forum or the legions on the frontier. It was the ideal of a community governed by law and directed toward the common good. An emperor who ruled justly, who upheld law and served the welfare of all citizens, could legitimately be seen as the head of that commonwealth. He was a magistrate fulfilling his role in the Cosmopolis. But an emperor who ruled through caprice, cruelty, and fear, a tyrant, had committed a fundamental philosophical crime. He had privatized public power. He had taken the commonwealth, which belonged to all, and turned it into an instrument for his private desires. In that moment, he ceased to represent the true res publica. He became, in Stoic terms, a private oppressor, a man acting against the rational order. Therefore, loyalty was not actually in conflict. True loyalty demanded allegiance to the commonwealth itself, to the ideal of justice it was meant to embody. Opposing the tyrant was not an act of treason against the state. It was the ultimate act of loyalty to the state's highest purpose. It was a defense of the real Rome against the man who was hijacking its name. Think of it like a ship's captain. The crew's loyalty is to the ship's mission, its safe voyage, and the well-being of all aboard. If the captain suddenly goes mad and tries to steer the ship onto the rocks for his own amusement, the most loyal act a sailor can perform is to seize the wheel. He is not betraying the captain's role, he is saving the ship from the man who has betrayed that role. The Stoic senator saw himself in that position. His oath was to the ship of state, to its destination of justice and common good. When the emperor turned the ship toward tyranny, the Stoic's duty was to grab the philosophical wheel, to stand up and say, "This is not our course." This reframing turned the charge of treason on its head. From the Stoic perspective, it was the tyrant who was guilty of treason. Treason against the Cosmopolis, against natural law, and against the very concept of the Commonwealth. The philosopher's opposition was a citizen's arrest of a corrupt official. This explains the calm, almost legalistic tone of their defiance. They were not rebels screaming for revolution, they were magistrates filing a dissent. When Helvidius Priscus insisted on calling Vespasian a fellow senator and citizen, he was making this point operationally. He was stripping away the imperial mystique and reducing the emperor to his proper office, an office that could be held accountable. By refusing to vote or walking out of a corrupted session, Thrasea Paetus was issuing a judicial finding that this proceeding does not meet the standards of the true res publica, and therefore I cannot participate. Their actions were not the start of a civil war. They were the closing arguments in a cosmic court case they had already decided in favor of justice. This philosophical clarity is what allowed them to face death not as desperate rebels, but as vindicated witnesses. They died not for overthrowing Rome, but for defending its deepest, truest self against the man who sat on its throne. That serene composure in the face of the executioner was not a passive surrender. It was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, and the battlefield was the tyrant's own need for control. An emperor like Nero or Domitian did not merely want to eliminate a critic, they needed to dominate the narrative of their power. A public execution was a carefully staged ritual. It was meant to broadcast a simple, brutal equation: defiance equals terror, equals pain, equals brokenness. The spectacle was designed to teach a lesson to every spectator that the state's violence was the ultimate, unanswerable truth. But what happens when the victim refuses to perform their assigned role in the script? When Seneca, with veins opened, calmly dictates his final thoughts to scribes, he shatters the entire production. He is not playing the part of the terrified, broken man. He is the director of his own final scene. For the tyrant watching from the palace, this calm is a direct assault on his authority. His power is built on the universal currency of fear. He expects, even requires, a predictable human response, pleading, screaming, a final moment of abject terror that validates the threat he represents. The Stoic's equanimity refuses to pay in that currency. It declares that the emperor's most terrible coin has no value here. This creates a profound and infuriating impotence. You can destroy a man's body, but you cannot conquer a mind that has already declared itself free. The violence, instead of demonstrating the state's strength, suddenly highlights its limitations. It reveals the tyranny to be a crude, physical force, utterly powerless over the realm that matters most, the inner world of a principled individual. This transforms the execution from a display of imperial might into a revealing demonstration of the emperor's own moral and philosophical poverty. The Stoic, standing in peaceful acceptance, becomes a mirror. In that mirror, the tyrant does not see a mighty ruler, but a slave to his own passions, rage, and insecurity. The philosopher's rationality reflects the emperor's irrationality. His courage reflects the emperor's cowardice, for what is cruelty but the cowardice of a soul that cannot win an argument with reason? This silent, visual argument is devastatingly effective. It forces everyone present, from the guards to the distant public hearing the story, to make a subconscious comparison. On one side, the state, with all its legions and laws, reduced to a trembling hand holding a sword. On the other, a single, unarmed man whose peace of mind is utterly unassailable, who, in that moment, truly possesses strength. The psychological victory belongs to the one who is not afraid. This weaponized tranquility goes beyond mere personal courage. It acts as a form of non-violent resistance that operates on the level of meaning. The tyrant seeks to use violence to impose a meaning. Your life is mine to take. Your principles are worthless. The Stoic, by meeting that violence with undisturbed reason, imposes a counter-meaning. My principles are beyond your reach, and you are merely an event in a well-ordered universe. By refusing to be terrified, he steals the intended moral of the story and writes his own. This is why the emperors often reacted with such disproportionate fury, ordering the destruction of the philosophers' writings and memories. They were trying to erase the victor's plaque, to claw back the narrative victory they had lost in the physical moment. They understood, on some level, that a man who dies well wins an argument that echoes through the ages. The true terror for a tyrant is not an enemy who fights, but an enemy who remains calmly, unbreakably, and visibly free. The echo of a Roman senator's silence did not fade with the fall of the empire. It traveled through centuries, carried on the pages of books, and in the arguments of thinkers who would reshape the modern world. This Stoic insistence on a higher, universal law became one of the most powerful ideas in Western political thought, a philosophical seed that grew into the concept of natural law. The first major bridge was built by Cicero, a Roman statesman deeply influenced by Stoic teachings. In his work on the laws, he argued that true law is right reason in agreement with nature, a force that is universal, unchanging, and everlasting. He wrote that this law binds all human society, and that a statute which contradicts it is no law at all, but a kind of violence. This was not a dry legal theory. It was the intellectual foundation for the very defiance we have witnessed, codifying the idea that an emperor's command could be judged illegitimate by a standard written into the fabric of the cosmos itself. This Stoic-infused concept of natural law was then absorbed and transformed by medieval Christian thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. He integrated it into a theological framework, proposing that divine law was revealed through Scripture, but that natural law was the way all rational creatures participate in the eternal law of God. The core principle remained: there is a moral order discoverable by reason, and human laws must align with it to be valid. This created a powerful tool for political critique. It meant that even a king anointed by God was not above the moral order. His authority was contingent on ruling justly in accordance with that higher law. When a ruler became a tyrant, violating natural law through oppression or cruelty, he broke the very covenant that legitimized his power. This idea gave theologians and philosophers a language to justify resistance, not as rebellion, but as a correction of a ruler who had strayed from the path of right reason. The journey culminates in the Enlightenment, the era that gave birth to modern democracy. Here, the ancient Stoic concept of the Cosmopolis, the universal city of rational beings, finds a stunning new expression. Thinkers like John Locke and later the founders of the United States spoke not of subjects under a king, but of citizens possessing inherent, inalienable rights. These rights to life, liberty, and property were not gifts from a government. They were understood as endowments from nature and nature's God, birthrights of every rational human being by virtue of their existence in a rational universe. This is the Stoic Cosmopolis translated into a political doctrine. Government, in this view, exists by a social contract to secure these pre-existing natural rights. Its power is loaned to it by the people, the citizens of the earthly city, and when a government becomes destructive of those ends, violating the higher law it was established to uphold, the people have not just a right but a duty to alter or abolish it. That phrase, a duty to alter or abolish, carries the distant, unmistakable cadence of a Stoic senator rising to speak. The thread is astonishingly clear. From Cicero's right reason in agreement with nature, to Aquinas's framework for a tyrant's illegitimacy, to Locke's inalienable rights and the right of revolution, we see a direct lineage of an idea born in the Roman Senate. The uncompromising stance of Thrasea Paetus and Helvidius Priscus was more than personal courage. It was an early, dramatic enactment of a principle that would one time underpin constitutions and declarations of independence. Their defiance planted the notion that authority is always accountable to a standard beyond itself, that power is a trust, not a possession. Every time the concept of human rights is invoked against a modern tyranny, or a court strikes down a law as fundamentally unjust, the ghost of that ancient philosophy is present. It reminds us that the courage to say no to power often begins not with a weapon, but with a philosophy that teaches you what truly belongs to you and what does not. The ancient Stoics' quiet walk from the Senate floor may seem a world away from a 20th century protest march, but the template of their resistance is startlingly familiar. It is a pattern of conscience that reappears wherever individuals choose to confront power with nothing but their own integrity. Look at the movements led by Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Václav Havel. While their causes, contexts, and beliefs were profoundly different from those of a Roman senator, the architecture of their defiance shares a common blueprint, one the Stoics helped draft. Each of these modern figures acted from a commitment to a higher principle they believed was more real than the laws of the state. For Gandhi, it was satyagraha, the force of truth. For Dr. King, it was the moral law rooted in divine justice and the American promise of equality. For Havel, the Czech playwright turned dissident, it was simply living in truth within a system built on lies. None of these are political platforms in the ordinary sense. They are philosophical stances, claims about a fundamental reality that human laws must reflect to be legitimate. This is the direct descendant of the Stoics' cosmic law, the belief that an unjust statute is a form of violence against a deeper order. Their action, like that of Thrasea Paetus or Helvidius Priscus, was non-violent but deliberately confrontational. Gandhi's Salt March was not a retreat, it was a public, theatrical violation of an unjust monopoly. Dr. King's marches into segregated cities were not requests, they were embodied arguments placed directly in the path of injustice. Havel's act of writing a play banned by the state, or his refusal to leave his country when exiled, were quiet, firm collisions with the regime's rules. They did not seek violence, but they did not avoid the conflict that their principles made inevitable. They understood, as the Stoics did, that to witness for truth often means provoking a crisis that forces everyone to choose a side. And critically, each of these leaders and the movements they inspired embraced the willingness to accept punishment. They marched knowing they would be arrested. They spoke knowing they would be imprisoned. This was not masochism, but a calculated element of their strategy. By voluntarily accepting the legal consequences of their actions, they demonstrated that their commitment was stronger than the state's power to punish. It turned the jail cell from a place of shame into a platform of moral authority. This is the modern echo of the Stoic indifference to externals. The dissident says, "You can take my freedom, but you cannot make me believe your lies or accept your injustice. My peace is not for you to give or take." Finally, and most powerfully, they used personal sacrifice as a transformative public witness. Gandhi's fasts, Dr. King's repeated imprisonments and his final, foreseen sacrifice, Havel's years in prison, and his humble persistence, these were not private sufferings. They were public performances of conviction designed to awaken the conscience of the observer. Just as Seneca turned his death into a final lecture on liberty, these modern figures turned their hardships into living arguments. Their calm endurance under pressure made the abstract principle of justice visible, tangible, and unbearably compelling. It shamed the oppressor not with violence, but with an unanswerable display of human dignity. The Stoics did not invent civil disobedience, but they provided one of its earliest and most coherent philosophical archetypes. They demonstrated that resistance could be rooted not in a desire for power, but in a disciplined alignment with a rational, universal good. They proved that the most potent weapon against tyranny could be a life or a death lived in perfect, serene accordance with a law no emperor could ever repeal. This code was never meant only for emperors and senates. Its true power lies in its scalability, in how that same uncompromising engine operates when the tyrant is a manager, a popular friend, or a silent social norm. The process remains identical, only the stakes change from your life to your comfort, from exile to a sideways glance. It begins always with that first step of clear perception. You witness a colleague being unfairly blamed for a team's mistake. You hear a casual, cruel remark disguised as a joke within your friend group. You notice a policy at your local community center that quietly excludes certain people. In that moment, you are not just feeling discomfort. You are, like the Stoic senator, performing a philosophical assessment. Is this action in accordance with the rational law of the Cosmopolis, with basic fairness and respect? Does it serve the common good of this small human circle? If the answer is no, you have perceived an injustice. The scale is irrelevant to the principle. Next comes the crucial internal pivot, the act of withholding assent. This is where we usually fail, not on the battlefield, but in the break room. The impressions flood in. This isn't my problem. Speaking up will make things awkward for me. I might be labeled difficult. It could hurt my chances for that promotion. These are the modern equivalents of the emperor's guards at the door. The untrained mind immediately assents, agreeing that these social risks are ultimate evils to be avoided at all costs. The Stoic practice is to pause, to examine those impressions. Is social discomfort truly a catastrophic evil, or is it merely an external, a thing outside your moral character? Is the impression that I must stay silent to be safe actually true? By withholding your automatic agreement from that fear, you reclaim the very same mental sovereignty that Thrasea Paetus exercised in the Senate. You say no internally before you say anything aloud. Then, action. What does aligning your character with justice look like here? It is rarely a dramatic confrontation. It could be the vocal choice, gently correcting the record in the meeting to defend your colleague. It could be the silent, eloquent withdrawal, choosing not to laugh at the cruel joke. your quietness creating a pocket of dissonance in the room. It could be the simple refusal, declining to participate in spreading a harmful rumor or signing onto a misleading report. This is your walk out of the chamber. It is a proportional, reasoned action chosen because it is coherent with your role as a rational citizen of your own small cosmopolis, your workplace, your family, your town. Finally, you meet the consequences with equanimity. The manager may frown, the friend may mock your seriousness, you might be passed over for a social outing. These are your exile, your confiscated property. They belong to the realm of things not up to you. Your goal was the virtuous action itself, the alignment of your conduct with justice. The social fallout is an external event to be accepted, not a verdict on the rightness of your choice. This framework transforms everyday moral friction from paralyzing anxiety into a series of manageable philosophical steps. You are not reacting from raw emotion, but navigating from principle. The co-worker who consistently takes credit for your ideas is not a monster, but a person acting out of sync with the natural law of fair contribution. Your choice to calmly document your work and later, if necessary, discuss it with a supervisor is not office politics. It is cosmic housekeeping on a micro scale, an assertion that the rational order should apply here too. The quiet neighbor who stands up at a town council meeting to question a new rule that feels unfair is channeling Helvidius Priscus. They are treating local authority as a magistracy accountable to the common good. They are performing the same duty just on a smaller stage. This is how the philosophy stays alive. It does not wait for a tyrant to test it. It is practiced daily in 1,000 minor calibrations of character, each one strengthening the muscle memory for integrity. When you choose the harder right over the easier wrong in a situation no one else will ever see, you are walking the same path. You are maintaining the unity of your virtues. You are giving the sage compass a slight, steady nudge toward true north. The ultimate purpose is not to become a professional dissident, but to build a life where your inner citadel is so secure that no external pressure, whether from an emperor or an office bully, can force you to betray what you know is right. That citadel is built one honest conversation, one upheld standard, one quiet refusal at a time. What legacy is built from these small, daily acts of coherence? A valid and necessary objection arises from this history. The story of the Stoic opposition is undeniably a story of elite men, senators with wealth, education, and a platform from which to speak. It is easy to dismiss their defiance as a luxury of privilege, a moral stance only affordable to those who already possessed social power. Could a slave, a poor laborer, or a woman without legal standing have practiced this same uncompromising code? To ask this is to engage with the philosophy at its most demanding level. The historical record is shaped by who had the means to leave a written legacy, and that skews our view. But the philosophy itself, in its pure logic, was never meant to be exclusive. Its most powerful teacher was a man who had known the absolute bottom of Roman society, Epictetus. His life stands as a permanent rebuttal to the charge of elitism. He was not born to a senatorial family. He was property. His body bore the marks of a master's cruelty. Yet from that experience of total external powerlessness, he forged the definitive guide to internal freedom. His school taught not how to rule an empire, but how to rule oneself, a lesson available to anyone with a mind to learn it. His very existence proves that the Stoic code was not a handbook for the aristocracy, but a map for the human soul, regardless of its external station. The core duty, to live in accordance with reason and justice, is not scaled to your bank account or your social rank. It is scaled to your sphere of influence. For a senator like Thrasea Paetus, his sphere was vast. It included the Senate floor, the courts, the governance of provinces. His duty to justice, therefore, played out on that grand public stage. His refusal to vote was a seismic event precisely because his platform was so high. For a slave in the same era, the sphere was brutally constricted. He did not control his body, his labor, or his destiny, but according to the Stoic view, he still controlled the one thing that mattered most, his moral purpose, his proherses. His sphere of influence might be the shared misery of the slave quarters. Within that tiny, suffocating space, the call of the Cosmopolis still echoed. The duty to act justly could take a form almost invisible to history. It might mean refusing, at great personal risk, to betray a fellow slave who had stolen a crust of bread. It might mean sharing a meager portion of water with someone even weaker. It might mean maintaining a sense of inherent dignity when the entire world insisted you had none. For a poor free citizen, a baker or a carpenter, the sphere was different again. His duty might involve refusing to shortchange a customer, speaking up against a corrupt local official, or simply raising his children to value honesty over gain. The principle is universal, a constant. Give each person in your cosmopolis, however small that city may be, what is properly due to them. The expression of that principle is infinitely variable, shaped by circumstance, courage, and the tools at hand. The Stoic senator and the Stoic slave were both citizens of the same universal city. One was a citizen with a loud voice in the forum, the other was a citizen in chains. But both were bound by the same rational law. The historical accident that we remember the speeches of the senators and not the quiet endurance of the slaves does not mean the philosophy only worked for the powerful. It means history often forgets the most profound acts of courage because they leave no marble statues behind. The code's scalability is its true test. If it only functioned for the privileged, it would be a moral ornament, not a philosophy. The fact that a former slave could become its greatest teacher demonstrates that its power came from within, a fortress that could be built in any condition under any master. This does not erase the real advantages of the senators. Their privilege gave their defiance an amplifying echo we can still hear, but it should reframe how we see them. They were not brave because they were privileged. They were brave because they used their privilege for something their philosophy demanded, despite the terrible cost. They leveraged their platform, the one they were born with, to perform a duty that was, in essence, no different from the duty of the person born with nothing. Both were asked to be just where they stood. One stood on a marble dais, the other stood in the dust, but the law they answered to was written in the same stars. This chain of logic left no weak links. At one end was the logos, the rational principle ordering the cosmos. At the other was the Stoic's own mind, a fragment of that divine reason. Connecting them was the single, unbreakable purpose of that reason, to manifest virtue, and virtue, by its very nature, demanded just action in the world. When an emperor commanded an act of betrayal or demanded silent complicity, he was not merely issuing a political order, he was demanding that a rational being act against reason itself. He was asking a citizen of the Cosmopolis to violate the fundamental laws of their own citizenship. For the Stoic, this created an internal crisis of coherence. To obey would be to shatter the chain that connected them to the universe. It would mean their inner logic was at war with their outer actions, a state of philosophical insanity. Their defiance, therefore, was not an emotional outburst of anger or a political gambit for power. It was the logical, necessary output of a perfectly coherent system. Think of it as a mathematical equation where every value is fixed. If A equals living in accordance with nature, and B equals acting with justice, and C equals refusing to participate in injustice, then the moment an emperor introduces an unjust command, the solution for the Stoic is already solved. The answer is C. There is no variable for personal safety or social approval in that equation. Those are external to the calculation of virtue. This is why their courage could appear so superhuman, so serene. It wasn't rooted in a fiery passion that could burn out. It was rooted in a cold, clear certainty, as steady and undeniable as a geometric proof. They opposed the tyrant for the same reason a mathematician would reject a false solution, because their entire world would become meaningless if they accepted it. Their stand was the universe through the lens of a single human mind, correcting a local error in its own code. Their legacy is a stark and beautiful correction. We often mistake Stoicism for a philosophy of retreat, a serene detachment from a world we cannot control. But the history of its greatest practitioners tells the opposite story. It is a philosophy of courageous engagement, precisely because it teaches what we can control our own actions in defense of justice. The uncompromising code to live in accordance with nature did not send its followers into quiet gardens to escape tyranny. It sent them directly into its path, armed with nothing but reason and an unshakable sense of duty. This was not a contradiction, but the logical conclusion of their beliefs. When justice was at stake, defiance became a rational necessity, the only coherent action for a soul aligned with the cosmic order. It transformed philosophers into activists and senators into martyrs, not because they sought glory, but because their ethical framework left them no other honorable path. Their example stands as a permanent reminder that ethics, when rooted in deep, principled understanding, can demand the highest price. It asks not for occasional kindness, but for consistent courage, for a willingness to let your principles dictate your actions even when the cost is everything the world values. This ancient struggle is not a relic. The forms of power have changed, but the fundamental challenge remains. We may not face an emperor's guards at our door, but we encounter quieter tyrannies, systems of pressure, conformity, and institutional injustice that ask us to compromise our integrity for comfort, advancement, or simple peace. The Stoic code offers no easy answers, but it provides a clear compass. It asks us to perceive clearly, to judge rationally, and to act justly within our own sphere, however large or small that may be. Their stand invites us to consider what we are willing to bear witness to, and what lines we are prepared to draw, not in sand, but in the bedrock of our character. If this exploration of their uncompromising courage has resonated with you, and you wish to understand how to apply these principles in your own life, we have curated a list of essential Stoic readings and courses linked in the description. From the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius to the Practical Discourses of Epictetus, these resources offer a path to building that inner citadel, so that when your moment of choice arrives, you will know, as they did, which way true north lies.